Nobody tells you that the old life has to die. They tell you about the transformation, the breakthrough, the shift, the version of you that comes out the other side clearer, more grounded, more aligned with something real. What they leave out is what happens first. The part where everything you built stops working. Where the relationships that held your world together quietly fail. Where the job, the identity, the story you told about yourself, the one that made sense for years, suddenly doesn't anymore. Not because something external changed, because something internal finished. Jung spent decades watching this pattern, and the language he reached for is the framework he found adequate for describing what happens when a human being undergoes genuine psychological change didn't come from medicine. It came from alchemy. That sounds strange, a psychologist studying alchemy. But what Jung recognized, and he wrote about this extensively in Psychology and Alchemy and later in Mysterium Conjunctionis, was that the alchemists weren't simply trying to turn lead into gold. They were projecting an inner drama onto matter. The stages they described, dissolution, purification, recombination, were maps of what happens inside the psyche when transformation is underway. The first stage the alchemists described was the nigredo, the blackening. It's the phase of putrefaction, of decomposition, the moment where the original material, the prima materia, breaks down completely. Nothing is added, nothing is improved, the substance simply falls apart. And what Jung found, studying this across years of clinical work, was that every genuine transformation he observed began the same way. Not with insight, not with a decision to change, with dissolution. The psyche doesn't transform by addition. It transforms by collapse. The old structure, the identity, the beliefs, the relationships organized around a version of yourself that used to be sufficient, has to decompose before anything new can form in its place. That's the part that feels like dying, because psychologically, it is. There's a concept Jung borrowed from Heraclitus, an ancient Greek philosopher who understood this before anyone had the clinical vocabulary for it. Enantiodromia, the principle that when any psychological attitude reaches its extreme, it converts into its opposite. When control reaches its maximum, surrender arrives. When the defended self can no longer hold, what it was defending against breaks through. He wrote in Psychological Types that this occurs when an extreme one-sided tendency dominates conscious life, and an equally powerful counterposition builds underneath, eventually breaking through conscious control. What this means, practically, is that the collapse isn't random. It has direction. The thing falling apart is the structure that was holding you away from what needed to surface. And the falling apart is not a detour on the way to transformation. It is the transformation, already in motion, already doing its work before you've recognized it as anything other than loss. Recent research in post-traumatic growth confirms something Jung would have recognized immediately. Psychologists studying what happens after catastrophic disruption, loss, illness, the demolition of a life structure have found that genuine growth doesn't occur despite the breakdown. It occurs through it. The mechanism involves the disruption of core beliefs, the assumptions about yourself, and the world that organized your perception. When those shatter, there's a period of intense disorientation, rumination that feels pointless, a kind of meaning-making that hasn't yet arrived at meaning. What longitudinal studies show is that this disorientation phase, the part that feels like failure, is functionally related to what comes after. The people who experience the most disruption of their core belief systems were often the ones who eventually reported the deepest change. Not because suffering is valuable on its own, because the dissolution created the space that the old structure had been occupying. You can't build something new in a room that's still full. Jung knew this in his own body. In 1913, when his professional relationship with Freud was ending, and his interior world was fragmenting into visions he couldn't control, he described the experience as a Confrontation with the unconscious. That phrase sounds clinical. It wasn't. He was afraid he was losing his mind. His professional standing was eroding. His sense of who he was, the successful psychiatrist, the heir apparent to Freud's legacy, was decomposing in real time. What came out of that dissolution was the Red Book. Active imagination, the foundation of everything he built for the next 4 decades. None of it could have emerged from the intact version of who he'd been before. The old Jung had to dissolve first. I lived a smaller version of this. When I left the hospice after 12 years, it wasn't a clean departure. It was a slow collapse that I kept misreading as fatigue. I stayed too long, and I knew it. But the identity, the person who sits with the dying, who can hold what other people can't, that was load-bearing. It held up everything else I'd built my sense of self around. When that went, other things went with it. My marriage had been leaning on the same structure. It finished within the same year. There was a stretch of about 4 months where I couldn't have told you who I was. Not in the dramatic sense, in the literal sense. The things I had organized my life around were gone. Not taken exactly, finished, completed in a way that didn't leave room for continuation. And nothing was replacing what had left. I kept waiting for the next thing to arrive, and it kept not arriving, and the emptiness just sat there. What I didn't understand then, and what Jung's writing eventually helped me see, was that the emptiness wasn't the space between who I was and who I would become. It was the process, the nigredo, the blackening, the old material decomposing, so that something I hadn't yet imagined could form. Nothing I built afterward, this way of reading, this way of being with people, this way of paying attention, could have grown in the soil of who I used to be. That version of me was competent and useful and completely in the way. Here's the thing about the alchemical model that the self-help version always leaves out. The nigredo doesn't come with a timeline. You don't get a notification that says the dark part ends on Thursday. You're in it, and you don't know you're in it, and it feels like the end of something rather than the beginning. That's the design. Transformation doesn't announce itself as transformation while it's happening. It announces itself as loss. If everything around you is falling apart right now, if the structures are failing and the old answers don't work and the identity that used to fit feels like something you're wearing that belongs to someone else, I'm not going to tell you it's all going to be okay. I don't know that. Nobody does. What I'll tell you is what Jung found and what I found after him, and what the research keeps confirming in its own careful language. The dissolution isn't the obstacle to your transformation. It's the first evidence that it's already underway. Whatever is falling apart was finished before you noticed, and whatever comes next needs the room.